It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Here we are at the seventh film in Hammer Film's catalog of Dracula movies. By 1972, things were getting a little long in the tooth for the count. That's not just an accurate pun for how the series was going for Hammer, but it's also a hilarious one. Hey, I have to also entertain myself with these episodes too. But anyway, Dracula A.D. 1972 was a bit of a peculiar entry that I'll get into in just a moment. But this was Christopher Lee's sixth outing as Dracula. He was, as I've mentioned before, getting pretty tired of the role. In fact, he was actually rather desperate to get out of the role, which would lead him to really being more interested in films like Horror Express, The Wicker Man, and the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun. He was realizing that being such a powerful representation of Count Dracula was getting him typecast pretty badly, and he was struggling to find other roles that he could really get that would kind of stimulate him as an actor. In past entries of this series, Lee would either want to heavily change the script or simply not want to speak the dialogue given to him. He was becoming a little difficult for Hammer to work with, and on top of that, returns were diminishing. The first Dracula film they produced 14 years prior was a massive success and regarded as an undisputed classic in the horror genre. The subsequent sequels are mostly debated between being good and being retreads, or simply bordering on exploitation, with the mix of sexuality growing ever stronger in Hammer's films. Interestingly, that would work far, far better for other Hammer horror films such as The Vampire Lovers or Twins of Evil, but I digress. The one sequel, quote-unquote, that does tend to still hold a fairly favorable rating with the vast majority of fans was the one that Lee wasn't even in, 1960's The Brides of Dracula. That was a direct sequel to 1958's Dracula, as we see Peter Cushing's Van Helsing basically cleaning up Dracula's mess that has been left all over Eastern Europe. It's a good movie and one that I will eventually get around to. Just let me finish with Christopher Lee first. All of the other sequels didn't really include Van Helsing until now. Yep, Dracula A.D. 1972 brings back Van Helsing and is Peter Cushing. But wait, it gets weirder. This movie is set to take place first in 1872, which then has Dracula get resurrected 100 years later, and then in the then present of 1972. I guess Hammer decided that they had pretty much done all they could with Dracula in the Gothic settings of the late 19th century of the previous films. It was time to see what would happen if he was in the present. Dracula A.D. 1972 and the next film, The Satanic Rites of Dracula, create an interesting little continual story. It's the first time Hammer really paid a great deal of attention to carrying over as much continuity as possible from one film to the next. However, it actually doesn't fit with any other film in the history of the Hammer series. Their first Dracula film takes place in the 1880s, 1885 to be exact. And I think you could probably say the other sequels take place somewhere between 1886 and maybe 1895 or so. The original Dracula novel takes place, I think, roughly in the mid-1890s. It may actually be the mid-1880s, but it was published in 1897. So everything is basically screwed up. But you know what? Screw it. Just give the kids looking to neck with their significant others in theaters and drive-ins what they want, blood and tits. So yeah, Dracula A.D. 1972 and the Satanic Rites of Dracula are kind of in their own little continuity. Scars of Dracula just 2 years before was itself kind of a reboot. Hammer was kind of attempting to freshen up their Dracula and Frankenstein series a bit, and there was even a Mummy movie made in 1971 to kind of see if they could keep the train rolling on their franchises. So if you really take in what I just said, it was clear that there was no way to keep the train going. The reboots of Hammer's Gothic Titans would ultimately end each of the franchises within a short time. Well, the following year to be exact. Well, technically, there would be a 9th Dracula film in 1974 that Peter Cushing would sort of return for, but that's definitely a story for another time. Let's get into Dracula A.D. 1972. So yeah, we get a little bit of a prologue. At the start of this movie, we find Van Helsing taking on Dracula in 1872 on the back of a carriage that is speeding out of control. Now, this is not Abraham Van Helsing, but Lawrence Van Helsing. Not sure if that matters any at all, but that's what we're going with here, and that's what's going on. The narrator says this is yet another battle in the two rivals' never-ending war against each other, and when the carriage crashes, Van Helsing finds that Dracula is impaled on the broken wooden spokes in the carriage's wheel. He is able to bury the spoke deeper and causes Drac to disintegrate into ashes. A third person arrives on horseback and collects Dracula's ring and some of his ashes. He looks like a bad guy, and Van Helsing suffered fatal wounds, so he's pretty much useless to stop this weirdo from taking the ashes and the ring. No, considering the guy didn't take all of Dracula's ashes, I suppose it is possible that this is in continuity with everything in the past in the series. The guy in 1972 might just be taking those ashes and resurrecting a Dracula, not the Dracula. Maybe that's what the AD actually stands for, Dracula, a Dracula in 1972. Yeah, anyway. The guy buries the ashes and 100 years passes and modernity has basically taken over London. We see a bunch of people at a swinging party with a band and people in short skirts and lots of mod clothing and everything. The guy who collected the ashes at the beginning is still around, or it's possibly a descendant. All these crazy drug-addled partiers came with the band playing and really interrupting the whole party of these uppity jerks in this house. The cops are called, and the partiers even know how long it will take for the cops to get there, so I guess they're kind of used to crashing these sorts of things. And I bring these people up because the whole scene both seemingly goes on forever and features pretty much everything that makes this movie remotely memorable to people. This is the Gothic Dracula movie that is loaded with hippies and weirdos. And I will say that it's because they lean so hard into the era that it does kind of make this movie unfortunately miss the mark a little bit, even though there are a lot of really good things in this movie. But anyway, I do have 3 things I will talk about that I really like a little bit later. But Johnny, our guy who looks a lot like the guy who took Dracula's ashes, suggests that his crew do something new and a little different. He wants them to do some sort of a black mass. Now that sounds fun, doesn't it? Now once they finally all agree to do the spooky stuff, he drives home and gets his vial of ashes and a ring. It should be pointed out that there is a specific girl in this group named Jessica. Her grandfather is an expert on anthropology, which also includes demonology of different cultures. How did he get so good at knowing that stuff? Well, he's a Van Helsing. This Van Helsing, Lorimer, comes home and finds Jessica poking around his library and reading a book that he wrote on black masses. He doesn't want her to get involved with the stuff. He also doesn't really like her friends. In fact, he even calls them a gang. But later that night, Jessica and her boyfriend arrive at the church where the Black Mass is going to happen, and Johnny plays some weirdo music to get everyone to gyrate around as if they're on acid or something. Johnny starts doing a sermon demanding an audience with Satan. Johnny wants Jessica to be baptized by blood, but she's not into it. Instead, another of the group, Laura, volunteers. Now, Laura is played by Caroline Munro, one of Hammer's kind of darker and more sultry actresses, who we saw in Captain Kronos, Vampire Hunter. But Johnny has Laura on the altar, and he puts Dracula's ashes in a goblet and cuts his arm and lets his blood mix with the ashes. He then pours the ashy blood over Laura's body. Everyone runs away while Laura begs for help, and Johnny shouts that, quote-unquote, he actually wants Jessica. Now, Johnny is successful in bringing Dracula back, and Johnny's pretty happy and proud of himself. And he says that he did it, and he brought back his master. But Dracula just says that it was his will and walks inside the church, right past his follower there. There, he finds Laura and feeds on her. The next day, the group haven't seen either Laura or Johnny. However, Johnny does show up at the group's normal hangout and tells them that Laura has gone out of town to visit her family, as some school kids playing in the area of the church find Laura's body. Johnny does a halfway decent job convincing just about everyone except Jessica that it was all a big prank using blood capsules and getting Laura in on the gag. Now, spotting that Lorimer Van Helsing's granddaughter Jessica is one of Laura's known associates, the detectives in charge of this case, once her body was recovered, decide to start with the Van Helsings because Lorimer did help them with a past case dealing with a witchcraft cult of some kind. Now, considering there was a great deal of trauma around Laura's neck, Van Helsing thinks that maybe the killer was attempting to obliterate the real cause of her death, which was vampirism. He tells them about how his grandfather died fighting the greatest of all evils, Dracula, but the detectives don't really know how to take this info. Van Helsing is particularly bothered by the fact that they also came to talk to Jessica. The inspector does get good info from Jessica about Laura's last known whereabouts and whether or not she was alive the last time Jessica saw her. Now, Van Helsing soon discovers that Jessica's new friend Johnny Alucard is an anagram of Dracula. Speaking of Dracula and Johnny, Dracula is pretty pissed about Johnny bringing him someone other than the one he is really looking for, Jessica. However, Dracula kills the other girl anyway. He then turns Johnny into a vampire, who in turn makes Jessica's boyfriend Bob into a vampire in the hopes of luring Jessica to the Count. And it works. Because Jessica trusts Bob, he's able to convince her to go to their usual hangout, and he and Johnny attack her and take her to Dracula. They were also able to snatch a cross that her grandfather put around her neck to protect her off of her, at the cost of it burning Johnny's hand pretty good. But Van Helsing finds Johnny's place and confronts him. And he finds out that Dracula plans to turn Jessica into his bride at another black mass. Johnny attempts to attack Van Helsing, but the sun is rising outside. Van Helsing throws a Bible into Johnny's coffin and uses a mirror to reflect the sunlight onto Johnny, which then forces him into the bathroom, where he accidentally opens the blinds, and in the sunlight he falls backwards into his tub and turns on the shower by accident. Running water and sunlight kills the young vampire. Van Helsing knows the Dracula must be at the church where Laura was found, and when he gets there, he finds Bob dead from not being able to get out of the sunlight in time. He finds and entranced Jessica inside sleeping, and he goes about the business of setting up a trap for Dracula. But just before Dracula bites Jessica to begin turning her into a vampire, Van Helsing distracts him and forces Dracula to chase him through the church. Van Helsing first stabs Dracula with a silver dagger, which the entranced Jessica removes. So it's to that trap that he set, basically. It's plan B time. So Van Helsing gets Dracula to chase him to the edge of the wooden stake trap, and he throws holy water onto the Count to make him fall in. He then uses a shovel to push Dracula further onto the spikes, basically freeing Jessica from Dracula's control and making the Count melt to ash once again. So let's get to the three things that I do like about Dracula A.D. 1972, because there are things in this that are pretty interesting at the very least. First, this is a meaner and I think kind of more adult version of Dracula than ever actually seen before. Interestingly, this movie is only rated PG, where the last two and the next one were rated R. However, there's a kind of meanness to the characters themselves. These characters that ultimately become targets are hippies who aren't really very respectful except to maybe each other in some cases. There's a black mass that seems to be kind of graphic in dialogue and the mixing of the blood and spilling it over onto Caroline Munro. It's got an edge to it that I think really is trying hard to turn away from the more romantic gothic look and feel of the older Dracula films. I can see they were really definitely trying to appeal to a specific crowd with this one that wouldn't want stuffy old-timey characters but a more modern edge. I kind of appreciate that Hammer evolved with the times. There's a predatory nature to some of their movies of the time, and this one in particular that feels a bit more analogous to rape and a little more real-world brutality that goes on. Certainly the idea of tainting Jessica Van Helsing, played nicely by Stephanie Beacham, in a much more modern kind of role in the earlier scenes of the movie in particular, really just to get revenge on the family name that hunted him down, is Dracula's way of kind of mutilating the idea of her innocence. It's a decent concept that continues into the next movie. I also like that the authorities are called into this case early on. They go to talk to Van Helsing and don't immediately dismiss him as a crank because of what he says about vampires. Another idea that carries over to the next film is Michael Coles as Inspector Murray. I'm just happy that the cops don't waste time in the movie by being jerks about what their associate and expert in weird shit has to say about the case. Second, I like that there are some kind of dry, funny lines in this movie. As I mentioned, Johnny feels really proud of himself for bringing Dracula back, but Dracula won't give him any credit. Instead, he just says that it was his will that brought him back. And Dracula just isn't in the business of giving out credit no matter what you do for him, Bob. But after Bob and Jessica fled from the Black Mass, he tells her that they'll see Laura at their next hangout on the next day. Sure, she'll be quote unquote drained, but she'll be fine. She'll be there and she'll be fine. That's a fantastic line. It's said so off-putting or so offhandedly that you don't even really notice that he's actually kind of saying a pun or really kind of revealing what's really happened to her. Now, Jessica refers to the book on Black Mass that she's reading as being quote-unquote kinky, to which Van Helsing immediately fires back, "What's that?" And she has to explain that kinky is not what we all think kinky is, although I'm glad to know that kinky also could be a stand-in for spooks, hobgoblins, black magic, and all that jazz. I like that Johnny invites someone in for a bite at one point as he's gathering people for Dracula to feed on. There's a pointed attempt with the jazzier soundtrack meant to sound a little bit more like the recently popularized blaxploitation movies and to pep up the soundtrack. It's pretty obvious that Hammer wanted this to be a much more updated outing for the series and make it a bit snappier, and the puns and the wittier lines are kind of a nice added bonus, even if the movie, like I said, as a whole kind of misses the mark. And thirdly, I will go there. The opening scene, once the movie transitions to the present, is goofy as all get out. But it is also maybe trying to make its too on-the-nose commentary about the transition from the old style of, everything, to the present-day attitudes. You have these hippies dancing and partying and just being kind of loud and annoying, and you have the older, stuffier people just staring and being put off by their antics. It's very likely after the string of sequels that Dracula and Frankenstein had, things were stale and people weren't reacting to the classic characters as they once did. So it's possible Hammer decided they really needed to try to re-engage the younger audience and thought this was the way to do it. Of course, the stuffy old birds at the party pshawing at the youngsters dancing and carrying on and all that could be representative of the older fans of Dracula or Frankenstein or of the Hammer series in general. This was going to be something new, Granddad. This is the future and everything. It's just a thought, but for how silly and kind of dumb that whole scene with the hippies really is, I would have loved to have been in a theater when this was playing to a packed house with all sorts of different ages and such in there watching it. I know how I would react, but how would the younger audience members have felt? How would the older generation react to the movie? I like that the movie at least tried something different instead of just pumping out yet another movie about a local count terrorizing peasant girls who wander into the forest alone and so forth. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com, but don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Now, next time, it's the official countdown to the 200th episode of Monster Mondays, as I also enter the spookiest of all spooky months, October. So during the month of October, I'll be covering silent spooks, starting with the German expressionist masterpiece, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So until next week, stay spooky.